Jaden Carter, a fearless 13-year-old with a love for history, stepped into Mrs. Hastings's classroom, ready to learn, but she was ready to tear him down. Mocked, dismissed, and humiliated at every turn, Jaden became her target. What Mrs. Hastings didn't know was that Jaden's fire couldn't be extinguished. With his mother by his side, they ignited a battle that shook the school to its core and left Mrs. Hastings facing consequences she never imagined. Stick around. Jaden's story will inspire and move you. Hit subscribe and stand up for justice now. The classroom hummed with first-day energy as students filed into their seats, exchanging summer stories and laughter. The large windows of Mrs. Beatrice Hastings's 7th grade history class let in the bright morning sun, but the atmosphere shifted as soon as the teacher strode into the room. Her heels clacked sharply against the floor, silencing the students instantly. "All right, settle down!" Mrs. Hastings barked, her sharp eyes scanning the room like a hawk sizing up its prey. She had a reputation for being strict, some would say tyrannical, and she took pride in keeping her students in line. 13-year-old Jaden Carter sat near the middle of the classroom, carefully unpacking his notebook and pens. History was his favorite subject, and he couldn't wait to dive into the lessons. For Jaden, learning about the past wasn't just about dates and events. It was about people and their stories, including his own. Mrs. Hastings began handing out syllabi, her tone brisk and no-nonsense. "This semester," she announced, "we'll be focusing on family heritage. Each of you will complete a project detailing your family's history and present it to the class. I expect thorough research, creativity, and professionalism." Excited murmurs broke out among the students as they flipped through the syllabus. Jaden, always eager to engage, raised his hand. "Yes, Jaden?" Mrs. Hastings asked, her expression already tinged with impatience. "Do we have to present in front of the class?" Jaden asked politely. "Or can we submit a written report instead?" A smirk tugged at the corners of Mrs. Hastings's thin lips. "This is a history class, Jaden, not a creative writing workshop. You'll present, and hopefully," she added with a pointed glance, "your project will meet the standards of the rest of the class." A few students snickered, and Jaden's cheeks flushed. He lowered his hand, forcing himself to nod. At home that evening, Jaden was already thinking about his project. He knew exactly what he wanted to do. His grandmother, Lillian Carter, had been a civil rights activist in the 1960s. She often told him stories about her experiences growing up in the segregated South, marching for equality, and fighting against systemic racism. "Grandma," Jaden said as he sat with her on the porch, "can I use your story for my family heritage project?" Lillian's eyes softened as she smiled. "Of course, sweetheart. Our history is part of who we are. It's important that you tell it." Jaden spent the next week diving into his grandmother's world. She showed him old black-and-white photographs of marches, letters she had written to local newspapers, and even a faded flyer from a protest she had organized. Jaden carefully organized everything into a presentation, feeling a swell of pride as he pieced it together. "This is going to be great," he said to himself, imagining how inspired his classmates would be by his grandmother's courage. The day of the presentations arrived, and Jaden walked into the classroom clutching his poster board. His hands trembled slightly, but he took a deep breath, reminding himself that he was prepared. "All right, Jaden," Mrs. Hastings said, her voice dripping with skepticism. "You're first. Let's hope it's as good as you think it is." Jaden stood at the front of the room, his heart pounding. He began by introducing his grandmother and sharing her childhood experiences in the segregated South. His voice grew steadier as he described how she had joined the civil rights movement, helping to organize peaceful protests and marches. "She taught me that standing up for what's right is never easy," Jaden said, holding up a photograph of his grandmother at a rally. "But it's worth it if it means making a difference." The room was silent as he spoke, the students captivated by his words. Even the usual whisperers and doodlers were paying attention. But as Jaden looked at Mrs. Hastings, he noticed her frown deepening. When he finished, the silence lingered for a moment before Mrs. Hastings clapped once. The sound was sharp and hollow. "Well," she said, her tone dripping with condescension, "that was something. But Jaden, let's remember this is a history class. Your grandmother's activities might be important to you, But they're hardly relevant to what we're studying. Jaden blinked, stunned. But this is my family's history, he said, his voice wavering. Mrs. Hastings shrugged dismissively. Next time, focus on something more academic. Personal stories are nice, but they don't always fit the curriculum. A few students glanced at Jaden, their expressions sympathetic, but no one said anything. Jaden's chest tightened as he returned to his seat, humiliation washing over him. He stared down at his desk, trying to focus on the grain of the wood instead of the burning in his eyes. For the rest of the class, Jaden struggled to concentrate. Mrs. Hastings seemed to sense his discomfort and leaned into it. "Let's move on," she said, her voice brisk. "Who's next?" Hopefully, we'll see an example of how to stick to the assignment. Jaden felt like the walls were closing in. The pride he had felt earlier was replaced with shame and doubt. As the other students presented their projects, genealogies, family heirlooms, stories about great-grandparents from other countries, Jaden couldn't shake the feeling that he had somehow failed. When the bell finally rang, Jaden packed up his things quickly, keeping his head down as he left the classroom. At dinner that night, Jaden's mother, Danielle Carter, noticed that he was unusually quiet. "Everything okay, honey?" she asked. Jaden hesitated before telling her what had happened. "Mrs. Hastings said my project wasn't relevant," he mumbled. "She said it didn't fit the assignment." Danielle's face darkened. "She said what?" "She said I should have picked something more academic," Jaden continued. "Maybe she's right. Maybe I should have done something else." "Absolutely not," Danielle said firmly. "Your grandmother's story is American history. If Mrs. Hastings can't see that, then she shouldn't be teaching." Jaden looked up, surprised by his mother's intensity. "But what can we do?" "We'll start by making sure your voice is heard," Danielle said. "Your story matters, Jaden, and we're not going to let anyone make you feel like it doesn't." For the first time since the presentation, Jaden felt a flicker of hope. His mother's words stayed with him as he went to bed that night. He didn't know what the next day would bring, but he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. Over the following week, Mrs. Hastings' behavior toward Jaden Carter became impossible to ignore. Her thinly veiled disdain turned into open hostility, leaving no room for doubt about her prejudices. During a class discussion on famous speeches, Mrs. Hastings stood at the front of the room, her arms crossed as she surveyed the students. "Who can name a historically significant speech that shaped the world as we know it?" she asked. Jaden raised his hand eagerly. "Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech," he said with a smile. Mrs. Hastings sighed dramatically, her eyes rolling so hard it was a wonder they didn't stick. "We're discussing real speeches, Jaden," she snapped. "Ones that contributed to actual academic discourse, not political stunts." The words hung in the air like a slap. A few students laughed quietly, casting sideways glances at Jaden. "But Mrs. Hastings," Jaden began, his voice firm, "Dr. King's speech is one of the most famous in history. It inspired—" "I don't want to lecture on activism," Mrs. Hastings cut him off, her voice icy. "We're talking about serious intellectual contributions, not slogans designed to rile people up. Anyone else have a better example?" Jaden lowered his hand, the sting of her words twisting in his chest. The tension only grew during group projects later that week. Jaden's team was assigned to analyze the Reconstruction era, a topic he was excited about. He had read extensively about it and was eager to share his knowledge. But Mrs. Hastings seemed determined to undermine him at every turn. As Jaden outlined his ideas to his teammates, Mrs. Hastings hovered nearby, her eyes narrowing. "Jaden," she interrupted, her tone dripping with condescension, "maybe you should let someone else take the lead this time. You seem to have a knack for overcomplicating things." Her words were loud enough for the entire group to hear. Jaden felt his teammates shift uncomfortably. "I wasn't overcomplicating," Jaden replied, keeping his voice calm. "I was just explaining how the black codes affected—" "Enough," Mrs. Hastings snapped. "If you're so passionate about the topic, maybe you should keep it to yourself and let the others contribute for a change." Jaden's face burned, but he bit his tongue. He knew if he pushed back too hard, Mrs. Hastings would use it as another excuse to paint him as a problem. The final blow came when Mrs. Hastings returned an essay Jaden had worked on for days. The assignment was to analyze the economic and social effects of Reconstruction, and Jaden had poured his heart into it, drawing connections between historical policies and their modern implications. When Mrs. Hastings handed back the essays, she made a point of calling out Jaden in front of the class. "Jaden," she said loudly, holding up his paper, "this is a perfect example of what not to do. Sloppy arguments, overly emotional language, and an inability to stay on topic. CN." She slapped the paper onto his desk, her voice sharp enough to cut. "I expected better." Jaden stared at the red marks scrawled across the page, his carefully crafted points dismissed with phrases like irrelevant and too opinionated. The humiliation was suffocating, and as his classmates turned to look at him, he felt his cheeks flush with shame. "Maybe next time," Mrs. Hastings continued, her voice dripping with mock encouragement, "you'll stick to the facts instead of inserting personal bias." That night, Jaden sat at the kitchen table with his mother, Danielle Carter. The essay crumpled in his hands. "She hates me," Jaden said quietly. Danielle frowned, her jaw tightening. "What happened?" Jaden took a deep breath and told her everything. The comment about Dr. King's speech, the group project humiliation, and the way Mrs. Hastings had torn apart his essay in front of the entire class. "She said my ideas were biased," Jaden said, his voice trembling. "She acts like my history doesn't matter." Danielle's expression darkened with anger. "Oh, it matters, Jaden. It matters more than anything. And this teacher has no right to treat you this way." "She won't stop," Jaden mumbled. "She's just going to keep making me feel small." Danielle reached across the table and placed a hand on his. "Listen to me. No one has the right to make you feel that way. You're smart, capable, and your story matters. If Mrs. Hastings can't see that, then we'll make her see it." Jaden looked up at her, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "She's going to regret underestimating you," Danielle said firmly. "I promise you that." Jaden didn't know exactly how his mother planned to handle it, but for the first time in days, he felt like he had someone in his corner, and he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Danielle Carter wasn't one to tolerate injustice, especially when it involved her son. The moment Jaden finished telling her about Mrs. Hastings's blatant mistreatment, she sprang into action. By the next morning, Danielle was on the phone with the school, demanding an immediate meeting with the principal, Mr. Bradley Owens, and Mrs. Hastings. "My son deserves better than this," Danielle said firmly, her voice steady but sharp. "And I want to address it directly." Principal Owens, sounding reluctant, agreed to the meeting. Danielle scheduled it for later that week, determined to walk in prepared. In the days leading up to the meeting, Jaden worked with his mother to build a case. Together, they sat at the kitchen table, going through his schoolwork and writing down every instance of Mrs. Hastings's biased treatment. "Here," Jaden said, holding up his graded essay. "She gave me a C-, even though my arguments were solid. Look at her comments. They don't even make sense." Danielle examined the paper, her frustration deepening. Words like irrelevant and biased were scrawled in red ink, but the essay's content clearly demonstrated thought and effort. "Good," Danielle said, setting it aside. "We'll use this." Jaden also provided detailed notes on Mrs. Hastings' behavior, the way she dismissed his contributions in class, her degrading comments about Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech, and her constant interruptions during group projects. "She made fun of me in front of everyone," Jaden said quietly. "It's like she's waiting for me to fail." Danielle's heart ached, but she pushed her emotions aside. "We're going to make sure she can't do this to you, or anyone else, ever again," she promised. They even gathered statements from two of Jaden's classmates, Mia and Ethan, who had witnessed Mrs. Hastings's behavior. "She definitely treats Jaden differently," Mia wrote. "It's obvious. She never talks to anyone else like that." When the day of the meeting arrived, Danielle dressed in a tailored blazer, her posture straight and commanding as she walked into the school. Jaden was by her side, holding a folder containing all the evidence they had gathered. In the principal's office, Mrs. Hastings was already seated, her arms crossed and her expression icy. Principal Owens sat behind his desk, his hands folded. "Thank you for meeting with us," Danielle began, her voice calm but resolute. "I'm here because my son has been repeatedly singled out and humiliated in your classroom, and it needs to stop." Mrs. Hastings let out a scoff, her lips curling in disdain. "With all due respect, Ms. Carter, I treat all my students equally." Danielle raised an eyebrow, her expression unimpressed. "Really? Because Jaden has evidence to the contrary." She turned to Jaden, who took a deep breath before opening the folder. He began by recounting the incidents, the dismissive comments, the unfair grades, and the way Mrs. Hastings had ridiculed his grandmother's story during his family heritage presentation. "She said my history wasn't relevant," Jaden said, his voice trembling slightly. "She told me to focus on something more academic." Danielle chimed in, her voice sharpening. "You dismissed my son's family history as irrelevant? His grandmother's contributions to the civil rights movement aren't academic enough for you?" Mrs. Hastings' face tightened, but she remained silent. Jaden continued, handing over copies of his graded essay and detailing how Mrs. Hastings had publicly criticized his work in front of the class. "She said my ideas were too biased," Jaden said, his frustration breaking through. "But all I did was connect Reconstruction policies to modern issues. How is that biased?" Principal Owens reviewed the essay, his brow furrowing as he read Mrs. Hastings' comments. Danielle leaned forward, her tone growing sharper. "And this isn't an isolated incident. She's consistently interrupted him during discussions, belittled him in front of his peers, and dismissed his contributions. That's not teaching. That's targeting." Mrs. Hastings finally spoke, her voice defensive. "Jaden is simply too sensitive. He takes everything personally. If he feels targeted, that's on him, not me." Danielle's eyes flashed. "This isn't about sensitivity. This is about your behavior, your refusal to respect my son or his history." She gestured to the folder. "We've documented enough evidence to show a clear pattern of bias and mistreatment." Principal Owens looked at Mrs. Hastings, his expression grim. "What do you have to say to these accusations?" Mrs. Hastings' jaw tightened. "I run a disciplined classroom. I don't coddle my students, and I certainly don't play favorites. If Jaden is struggling, maybe he needs to take responsibility for himself instead of blaming me." Danielle's voice rose, controlled but firm. "Struggling. My son has excelled in every subject until now. The only difference in this class is you. Your dismissive attitude, your prejudiced comments. Don't think for a second we don't see it for what it is," Jaden added, his voice steady despite the tension. "You called Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech a political stunt. You told me to stop overcomplicating things during group work. You even said my ideas were irrelevant because they focused on race. How is any of that fair?" Principal Owens's expression darkened further. He turned to Mrs. Hastings. "Is this true?" Mrs. Hastings hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I was trying to steer him toward topics that are more universally relevant," she said weakly. "Universally relevant?" Danielle repeated incredulously. "My son's heritage is universal. His history is American history. What you're doing is erasing it, and that's unacceptable." Principal Owens nodded slowly. "We take these accusations seriously. Based on the evidence provided, I'll be conducting a thorough investigation into your behavior, Mrs. Hastings." Mrs. Hastings' face paled, her usual confidence faltering. "I assure you, Principal Owens, I've done nothing wrong. This is a misunderstanding." "I've seen enough to know this is more than a misunderstanding," Principal Owens interrupted. He turned to Jaden and Danielle. "Thank you for bringing this to our attention. Rest assured, we'll take appropriate action." Danielle gave a curt nod, her eyes still locked on Mrs. Hastings. "I hope so, because no child should have to go through what my son has endured." As Danielle and Jaden left the office, Jaden felt a weight lift from his chest. His mother placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You did great in there," she said. "Do you think it'll make a difference?" Jaden asked, his voice uncertain. Danielle's eyes softened. "It already has. You stood up for yourself, Jaden. That's the first step. Now let's see what they do next." As they walked out of the school, Jaden felt a spark of hope. For the first time in weeks, he believed that things might finally start to change. The meeting with the principal had been a start, but for Jaden Carter, things only got worse before they got better. Despite Principal Owens's promise of an investigation, Mrs. Hastings returned to class the next day with a smile that didn't reach her eyes and a sharpness in her tone that seemed more pointed than ever. "So," she said, her voice cutting through the room as Jaden took his seat, "it seems some people think I'm not doing my job properly. Let's see if we can prove them wrong, shall we?" The class was silent, but the tension was palpable. Mrs. Hastings' eyes darted toward Jaden, and he felt every student's gaze follow. Over the following days, Mrs. Hastings' behavior grew more vindictive. She made a point of calling on Jaden for the hardest questions so obscure or complex that no seventh grader could be expected to know the answers. "Jaden," she said during a discussion on the Industrial Revolution, "perhaps you can tell us the exact year the first cotton spinning machine was patented? Surely, someone as passionate about history as you would know." Jaden hesitated, racking his brain for the answer. I'm not sure," he admitted, his cheeks flushing. Mrs. Hastings' smile was razor-sharp. "Of course you're not. Anyone else?" Several students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but no one dared speak up. One afternoon, during a pop quiz, Mrs. Hastings stood at the back of the room, her eyes boring into Jaden as he worked. When she handed back the graded quizzes the next day, she made a show of it. "Let's see," she said, flipping through the papers. "Ah, Jaden. Another disappointing result. I suppose this proves that talking about history and actually learning it are two very different things." She placed his quiz on his desk, with a bright red D scrawled across the top. "I tried my best," Jaden said softly, his voice barely audible. "Well," Mrs. Hastings replied, her voice dripping with disdain, "perhaps your best simply isn't good enough." Jaden's classmates looked at him with a mix of sympathy and helplessness. Even those who had laughed at Mrs. Hastings' earlier remarks began to see the cruelty in her actions. The investigation progressed slowly. Principal Owens had conducted interviews with Jaden and Danielle, as well as a few other students and parents, but Mrs. Hastings continued to teach while the process unfolded. Danielle, frustrated by the lack of immediate action, pushed harder. "This isn't just about Jaden," she told Principal Owens during a follow-up meeting. "It's about every student who has ever been silenced, dismissed, or humiliated by someone in a position of power. If you don't act, you're complicit." Her words struck a nerve. Owens escalated the investigation, reaching out to former students and parents who might have had similar experiences with Mrs. Hastings. The results were damning. Several students from previous years came forward, sharing stories of Mrs. Hastings' bias and mistreatment. Parents recalled how their children had come home in tears after being belittled in class. One parent even provided a written complaint they had filed years earlier, which had been ignored by the administration at the time. The turning point came when Jaden's classmate Mia, who had witnessed many of the incidents, decided to speak out publicly. During lunch one day, she approached Jaden in the cafeteria. "Hey," she said hesitantly, sitting down across from him. Jaden looked up, surprised. "Hi. I just wanted to say—" "I'm sorry," Mia said, her voice earnest. "I laughed in class when Mrs. Hastings made those comments about you. I thought it was easier to go along with it, but it wasn't right." Jaden nodded slowly. "Thanks," he said. "She's wrong," Mia added. "About you. About your history. About everything. I just wanted you to know that." Her words gave Jaden a boost of confidence he hadn't felt in weeks. Within a month, the evidence against Mrs. Hastings was overwhelming. The school held a meeting with her, during which Principal Owens presented the findings of the investigation. Her pattern of bias, humiliation, and unfair treatment was undeniable. By the end of the week, Mrs. Hastings was placed on administrative leave. When the news broke, Jaden felt a mix of relief and vindication. For the first time in weeks, he walked into the classroom without a knot of dread in his stomach. The school, recognizing the damage that had been done, took steps to rebuild trust with the students and their families. Principal Owens announced a school-wide initiative to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion. One of the first events was a Black History Month assembly, and Jaden was invited to share his family heritage project once again, this time in front of the entire student body. Standing on the stage in the school auditorium, Jaden felt a surge of pride as he looked out at the crowd. He took a deep breath and began. My grandmother, Lillian Carter, always said that history isn't just about what happened. It's about who tells the story, Jaden said. Her story, like so many others, is part of the fabric of our country, and I'm proud to tell it. He spoke with confidence and passion, sharing his grandmother's experiences as a civil rights activist and the lessons she had passed down to him. When he finished, the applause was deafening. Students stood, clapping and cheering, as Jaden's classmates surrounded him with words of encouragement and support. Principal Owens stepped onto the stage and handed Jaden a framed certificate. This, Owens said, is in recognition of Jaden Carter's courage and his contribution to fostering understanding and awareness in our school. The standing ovation that followed brought tears to Jaden's eyes. As for Mrs. Hastings, her regret was bitter but shallow. Her career, once built on her authority and control, now served as a cautionary tale. The stories of her prejudice and cruelty spread far beyond the school, tarnishing her reputation. Jaden, however, walked away stronger. The experience had tested him, but it had also proven his resilience. He had learned to stand up for himself and his history, and in doing so, he had inspired others to do the same. As he left the stage that day, surrounded by his friends and family, Jaden knew one thing for certain. His story mattered, and he would never let anyone silence it again. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing. I put a lot of time into crafting these heartfelt narratives, and your support means the world. Thank you for being part of this journey.